I'd like to talk about the immigration fraud interview. It's called the Stokes interview. And what happens is that people, when they get married, they go for the initial interview. And perhaps something they do, or the way they're acting, or their movement, makes the immigration officer doubt that it's a real marriage. So the immigration officer will ask some questions at that interview, but there's a limit to what he can do at the initial interview. So if for any reason the immigration officer suspects that it's a marriage fraud, he will then schedule what's called a Stokes interview. In every state, it's a little different. For example, in New York, you get a letter, and a year later you have the Stokes interview. In New Jersey, they could separate you the same day and do the Stokes interview. And how is the Stokes interview conducted? Well, the immigration officer initially sees both of you. You have to raise the right hand, you're telling the truth, and then he will say, Mrs. So-and-so, will you step out while I speak to your husband? And then he starts asking questions. And basically, from my experience, they can ask upwards of 100 questions, and in detail. And the lawyer who's sitting there all the time, what he does, he doesn't speak at all unless there's a misunderstanding between the examiner and the applicants, but he takes notes. So he writes everything that the husband said and everything that the wife said. So if they deny it or they have a problem with something, he will be a witness for that. Now, they get the husband in and ask him, as I said, perhaps 100 questions. Then he will ask him to leave the room, brings in the wife, and then ask her the same questions. And then what happens? If they're all exactly the same, no problem, he approves the case. But if there are some discrepancies, some of the answers are not quite the same, that's when it starts. They will give you a chance to try to explain. And sometimes it's a good reason. For example, I had a case where the husband said that there are 2 windows in the living room, and the wife said there is only 1 window. And so the officer said, God, they don't even know how many windows in the living room. But when they came in and they drew out a picture of the window, it turns out there are 2 panes with 1 big frame, and each pane opens up independently. So one person says there are 2 windows, the other one says because it's 1 frame, there's 1 window. So that was understood. And you can go through all the questions that are not matching exactly and explain away the reason. But if there are too many or they're completely ridiculous, you're not going to be able to do that. And of course, they ask some questions that are very difficult if you don't live together. For example, who got up first this morning? Who had made the breakfast? What did the husband have for breakfast? What did the wife have for breakfast? Where do you go shopping? What's the usual place? What does your husband prefer? What's his favorite food? On the bed, show me what side of the bed you sleep on, what side does the husband sleep on? And they go on and on and on. That makes it difficult because when it's 100 questions, that's a lot of questions. And even if it's a real marriage, you can make mistakes. I've also found that there are people that have very bad memories. I had a couple some years ago came to me. The gentleman was I can't say elderly because I'm older, but maybe he was 55 years of age with blondish white hair and blue eyes. And the woman was a Brazilian lady, darker, mulatta. They were quite different. And the husband, the U.S. citizen, he had a bad memory. And he kept on making mistakes. But they met with me and they said, Mr. Abson, it's real. I just can't remember. But the Immigration Service had denied them. We tried to explain everything away. They didn't agree. And the next thing you know, he was put in deportation proceedings. At deportation, I sent him to a psychologist to do a test. And the report came back that he has a memory problem. And once the psychologist testified and the judge asked a few questions, the judge approved it. These Stokes interviews are difficult, and if you have a problem like that, I suggest you don't go by yourself. See an experienced attorney, let him explain how it works to you, and to simplify the process and make it less stress for both you and your husband. If you need any help in this area, don't hesitate to contact me. Schedule an appointment.